Good morning, everyone. This is Generic Fool's Test. Good morning, everyone. This is Generic Fool's Test. I am sorry for taking a little bit longer to start today. After starting the stream, I realized that I needed to, wash my face a bit more. Well, whatever, you don't need to hear about the IRL stuff. Normally, I don't cover this type of thing, but because my normal audience is currently unavailable, and don't think a lot of the people who, watch me actually rewatch old streams, or streams that they weren't able to catch. To be fair, some of my streams can be hours long, and not many people have the patience to watch that, or the free time. Most importantly, the free time. Most people don't have that. Wouldn't have time for that. But either way, I am going to be covering some of the Paper Skies and Fat Electrician channels, some of the videos from them. Specifically, I'm going to be covering stuff relating to some of the Soviet Union. Now, of course, this isn't going to be enough of a stream to cover the entire breadth of the history of the Soviet Union, but this is a morning stream which I do before I have to go to work. Without further ado, we'll get into the first video, which is how the Soviets stole the B-29. Now, brief overview that for people, actually the video will cover it, so I should probably not cover that because it will literally go into more detail and you'll learn about it from somebody who is far more learned than I am about this subject. Without further ado, let us begin.
3rd of August 1947, large crowds of Soviet people
I'm going to turn on the auto-generated because this guy is a Ukrainian and has a slight Ukrainian accent. Normally he provides actual subtitles, but this time they're only auto-generated. Either way,
to Tushino airfield to watch the air parade celebrating Soviet Aviation Day. As always, the parade was attended by the Soviet leadership, including Joseph Stalin himself, who was visibly in a good mood. Opening the parade were 3 new Soviet heavy bombers.
For those who are just listening in the background, I'll read the subtitles here. Flying over the Tushino airfield are bombers of the latest design, heavy long-range 4-engine bombers. Our flying fortresses.
As excited as the Soviet people were with the spectacle, there was an equal amount of confusion among the foreign visitors because the new Soviet bombers looked exactly like the American Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. During World War II, 3 such US bombers crash-landed in the USSR, and the Americans thought that the bombers in the parade were those B-29s only repaired and repainted, as it was simply impossible to believe that the Soviets in such a short time had managed to copy such a technologically complex US bomber. The Americans were wrong, however, as those new bombers were indeed made in the USSR. The new Soviet bomber was the Tupolev Tu-4, and in one thing the Americans were right. It was an exact copy of the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. But why would the Soviets, instead of building something new of their own, just bluntly copy the American bomber? And most importantly, how did they do that? As World War II neared its end, Comrade Stalin began to
I'm going to pause it a bit because, if I don't pause it occasionally and put some of my own thoughts, then I'm blatantly stealing content. And I'd rather not. So, if you've just come to this channel to learn about... Well, you haven't been here long, so just in the event you want to not hear some pretentious jerk's opinion, the pretentious jerk being me, and just want to find some interesting videos, I will say, Paper Skies, how the Soviets stole the B-29 and called it their own. That's the name of the video if you want to find it without having to listen to my constant interruptions and my obnoxious comments. That's the first one. The second one I was going to cover is, or I intend to cover, is from the Fat Electrician, the biggest logistical flex of all time, the Berlin airlift, which I've spaced the videos between Internet Historian and Paper Skies between because Paper Skies is more of a straight playing historian when discussing videos. So, if you don't mind listening to a lot of the facts in more in-depth detail, while Fat Electrician is more of a entertainment. He applies a lot of memes, he's a lot faster, and his videos tend to be much shorter than, on average, than Paper Skies. And so he adds a lot of his own character to it. Now, Paper Skies does add his own bias to it because he grew up in the Soviet Union before it collapsed. And his father was actually a pilot for the Soviet Air Force. So he provides some rather interesting insight to certain things since he grew up at the tail end of the Soviet Union before its collapse. The video after that is the hilarious backstory of the Russian missiles hitting toilets in Ukraine, which, okay, that sounds terrible, but it's talking about if Russia's actually not trying to hit civilian targets, because it turns out during the development of a lot of Russian missiles, they cut tons of corners. And it turns out that oftentimes they would end up hitting things like toilets or other stuff. However, the video itself is far more interesting than anything I could actually interject at this point. The one after this would be the Berlin Wall, how communism turned East Germany into a prison state. And then after that would be when the Soviet Navy lost 16 admirals in a single accident, the Tu-104 crash at Pushkin. A lot of people tend to try to talk about the Soviet military and air force as if they were flawless, the greatest military in the world. Well, when you have a literal propaganda machine and they constantly apply it and they refuse to record any horrible accidents, and anything that does occur that's a mistake, they tend to go, this didn't happen, and they cover it up. Of course you have inflated numbers that make you seem more competent. Most militaries cover up some things, but the US will occasionally mention, yeah, we fucked up, this happened. Which, the problem is, some people go and hear that and say, you see, the US military screwed up, the Russians never screw up, and it's just like, oh my God, that's because they covered everything. Oh. And somebody left. Oh no. I don't know. I kind of got my hopes up. Well, back to one viewer. I'll continue to try my best for them. But either way, those are the videos I'm covering. The reason I'm covering these videos in particular is due to the fact that oftentimes, or at least, well, to be fair, it's been a long time since I've been in the American educational system. But oftentimes they don't really cover the interesting parts of the battle. They just tend to go, on date, stuff happened. Moving on. Remember this for the test. And I was like, okay. When there's so much interesting things about the small details. But oftentimes it's done dispassionately, so it's uninteresting to everyone. But either way, let us continue.
Realized perfectly well that the friendly relations between the USSR and its allies in the anti-Hitler coalition were coming to an end, which was kind of expected from the get-go, considering that the Soviets' actions at the dawn of World War II, I mean the annexation of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, as well as parts of Poland, Finland, and Romania, went against the very principles of the United Nations Declaration.
Also, the people don't often bring up the fact that, The Russians were originally allied with the Axis powers, and the only reason they joined our side is basically because Hitler attacked them first. They attended to, both Germany and the USSR attended to backstab each other. It's just that Germany took the initiative first. They were both planning to do it. It's just that the USSR was like, oh, help us.
That the Soviet Union had signed so to get help in the war against Hitler. Yes, the United States and Britain decided to unite with the lesser evil to defeat a greater one, though it is debatable whether it was indeed the lesser evil. But nevertheless, Comrade Stalin believed that the possibility of him being the next in line after Hitler was higher than zero. And that was quite a reasonable expectation, since that was the time when democratic countries had finally learned from the brutal examples of Czechoslovakia and Poland a hard lesson that announcing deep concerns alone does not stop dictators. However, the threat wasn't particularly alarming for Stalin, considering that he had the largest land army in the world. This lasted up until August 1945, when the world witnessed the devastating power of atomic weapons, which finally ended World War II and also provided Joseph Stalin with the understanding that now he wouldn't be able to hide behind millions of his soldiers, for now even a single plane carrying a nuclear bomb could be enough to deprive the world of the progressive Soviet leader, and with him the hopes of ever living in a socialist paradise. The solution for Comrade Stalin was quite obvious. He needed his own atomic bomb so that Western countries, if not abandoning their plans entirely, would at least approach the idea of
because remember, as much as communists try to say that our current state is imperialistic, remember, the idea of communism is to grab the means of production, which often means the people, which is to say that you force everyone to become communist, whether they want to or not, as well as converting your neighbors. Now, the US does intervene in a lot of other countries, but at least we leave. We don't set up a puppet state and then basically, well, we have, but not. There's a difference on the same level. It's kind of like if you're a kid and you take, if you steal candy from a store, it's not good. But it's not at the same level as somebody who is an armed robber breaking into people's houses and stealing their trust, or stealing like the trust funds of the retirees. There's a difference in scale as well as how often it occurs.
Military invasion of the USSR with greater caution. Building an atomic bomb was an enormously difficult and expensive process, challenging even for wealthy and advanced nations like the United States and Britain. But fortunately for Comrade Stalin, the United
Also, I will say another thing. People often argue that, who won the war? Like, people say, oh, the Soviet Union did. Well, or the United States did. Well, here's the thing. If America did not actually send troops to fight in the war would have still been won. World War II still would have been won. That is a fact. It just would have taken many more years. Now, if the United States did not get involved, period, then the war would have been lost. Now, people hear that and go like, that's rather arrogant. It's like, have you learned history? Until the U.S. got directly involved, and even after it was directly involved, the U.S. supplied money, food, and tons of equipment and trucks to basically all of its allies. One of the reasons why Britain was able to stay afloat and keep fighting is because of the vast amounts of supply ships sent to the UK by the Americans every single day during the war, as well as the equipment and ammunition. Now, to be fair, not all of the stuff that was sent was amazing or great, but you know, having something that can get the job done is a good thing to have until you're able to get something that's perfect for the job. And in the Soviet case, they would just get tons of American aircraft, they'd get tons of American vehicles and trucks that would help with them with supplies and all that other stuff, but they're going to go a little bit into here to cover that. There's another fact that they cover directly in this video, which is rather important as to why the Soviet Union did so well in the Second World War, despite having so many issues.
United States and Britain were not only wealthy in resources and scientific talent, but also unfortunately in so-called useful idiots who provided the USSR with secret information on the creation of the atomic bomb. However, as much as it may seem that the hardest part for Stalin was over, just having the bomb without the means to deliver it to enemy territory was in essence useless. Back then, the only available means for that task were strategic bombers, and in this regard, Comrade Stalin was in a very poor situation. The issue was that during the war against Germany, the USSR hadn't focused much on strategic bombing, as there were neither the need nor the capability to do so. There was no need because the systematic destruction of the German military industry was carried out by the Allies, and no capability because Soviet strategic bombers existed only on paper. The Soviets did have a 4-engine heavy bomber.
Also, that's actually, I know I've been talking a ton of crap about the Soviet Union and Russia, but before the war, they did have a lot of really good engineers and scientists who, in some fields, they were actually advanced, or more advanced than some of the other parts of the world. I believe rocketry was one of the areas in which they were actually more advanced than almost anyone else. Now, the problem is that all these people, by the time of the war, were dead or in prison camps because Stalin does not trust the educated. So, tons of the brightest minds of the Soviet Union and of Russia before that were terminated just because one guy from Georgia, because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but Stalin isn't from Russia. He's a good old Georgian boy. Not the state, the country of Georgia. You might not, to everyone who doesn't speak Russian, they think he's speaking without an accent, but if you can actually understand Russian, I don't speak Russian, but from what I've heard, he speaks with a rather thick Georgian accent. But either way, the problem with the Soviet system is manifold.
The Petlakov P-8, but by the end of the war, its flight characteristics were already outdated. To make matters worse, due to an inherent engineering flaw that couldn't be corrected, the bomber's wings had a tendency to literally break off mid-flight. Meanwhile, in the United States, the task of carrying the A-bomb was carried out by the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, undoubtedly the best heavy bomber of World War II, whose development cost the US more than creating the atomic bomb itself. This was exactly the kind of bomber that Comrade Stalin wanted. However, there was little to no hope of finding.
Yeah, there are so many things that were put onto that one aircraft that makes it so advanced. It's a lot like one thing you might notice that's different from a lot of bombers of the time is that those turrets on top are not the big old ball turrets that they have or that you commonly see. The reason is because all these guns are remote controlled. Which, nowadays that might be like, so what? But at the time, most aircraft that had these types of guns, there was literally a dude inside of them. who was hanging outside of the aircraft in a ball that had a gun inside of it that was made of glass, which is why it was called a ball turret. And in addition, it also was insulated. So, before that, you just had to wear a very heavy jacket because you were basically exposed to the elements while flying up high. That's one of the reasons why a lot of bombers couldn't fly too high. That and a number of other issues, but I'm not going to cover everything. Just the sheer amount of things that had to go into this aircraft is insane. And as he said, it was the cost of developing this aircraft was more expensive than the Manhattan Project. Which, keep in mind, the people thought that a nuclear bomb was impossible, or the thing of science fiction at the time. People were working on death rays and other stuff like that because, it's like, it's far more reasonable for that to exist than a nuclear bomb. One of the weapons which was almost deployed, which a lot of people scoff at because it's just like, this thing is stupid, is the bat bomb. Because to put it simply, they attach little bomblets to bats, and then they put the bats inside of a container in the state of where they're in basically suspended animation or sleep. They drop the bomb has a parachute, it comes out, the container opens, giving the bats enough time to wake up fully from their slumber. And then, since it'll be done during the daytime, the bats find crevices to hide in. And once they're hiding in those crevices, the little tiny bombs that are on them, which are filled with napalm, will burn down whatever they're inside of. Now, people constantly insult the bat bomb because it's just like, it's stupid, it's ridiculous. According to the results, the amount of damage caused by the single time they accidentally used the bat bomb on themselves in the test area before they meant to shows that the amount of damage and precision of the damage dealt by the bat bomb would have been worse than the nuclear bomb. It would have also been a lot cheaper to produce. Especially since the target of the bat bomb was Japan, at the time, most of their structures were made out of bamboo and wood, which, as you know, burn very, very well. Napalm is a very, very bad thing. It is kind of funny to think that if they actually tried it, a single bat bomb would have been... Now, there's two sides. One, the bat bomb would have done far more damage to Japan, or to the areas that they drop it in, as opposed to, the nuclear bomb. But on the other hand, we wouldn't need to worry about all the nuclear radiation and the radioactive material that was released as a result of the bombs. Though the horror of the bombs is also what caused it. Plus, it's one of those cases of where, if it sounds stupid but works, then it's not stupid. But either way.
Did any useful idiots in the US Air Force willing to hand over strategic bombers to the USSR? And not that Comrade Stalin didn't try, as can be seen in the official correspondence between the Allied leaders during World War II. It's a bit amusing, by the way, to read through these messages and see how Joseph Stalin heartily thanked the Allies for bombing German cities and even requested that they intensify the bombings as it would help the
Your message informed me of the successful bombing of Hamburg received. I salute the British Air Force and welcome your intention to increase the bomber attacks on Germany.
USSR. Yes, these are the very same
I'm glad you intended to go on bombing German towns on an ever increasing scale.
bombings of German cities that Russia now blames the Allies.
Every blow delivered by your Air Force to vital German centers evokes a most lively echo in the hearts of many millions throughout the length and breadth of our country.
For calling them barbaric and
I regret the Soviet Air Force is, for the time being, unable to take part in the bombing of Berlin.
unnecessary. Anyhow, at the very end of 1942, US President Roosevelt had written to Stalin that due to a possible attack by Japan on the USSR, he proposed to preemptively transfer an Air Force unit of 104 engine heavy bombers to the USSR. To which Stalin replied, as it called in Russia, plain dumb, "Thank you so much for the 100 bombers, but send them without pilots as we have enough of our own, and we will use the bombers in the West because in the Far East the USSR is not in a state of war." This, by the way, is a very interesting point that somehow receives little attention when talking about relations between the Allies. Pretty much through all of World War II, Britain and the United States, in addition to fighting Hitler in Europe and Africa, also carried the full burden of the war against the huge empire of Japan. On top of that, all the time they provided their ally, the Soviet Union, with an enormous amount of vital supplies. However, the USSR in turn was not in a hurry to help its allies in the war against Japan. Moreover, during all those years, Japan was freely extracting oil and coal for its own needs in the USSR. I'm referring to the oil and coal concessions in Soviet Sakhalin that were granted to the Empire of Japan in 1925. It wasn't until 1944 that the USSR and Japan signed an agreement to prematurely cancel these concessions, with the USSR paying the Japanese government almost $1 million in compensation. Sorry, my English is not good enough to properly describe this Russian way of treating its allies. One can only imagine how much sooner World War II might have ended if the USSR had allowed the US to deploy its bombardment units in 1942, for example in Vladivostok. This would have enabled US bombers to reach Japan without waiting several years, spending enormous amounts of military resources, and most important,
Yeah, think about all of the Marines who had to die because Russia refused to let us put bases or, like, even just briefly operate off of their soil.
losing tens of thousands of American, British, and other soldiers' lives before capturing the Mariana Islands.
And before somebody says something like, "Oh, hi, welcome to the channel. Sir talks a lot. I'm also somebody who tends to talk a lot. How are you this morning?" That's good to hear. Do you have an interest in history, or are you just, I happen to be around and you decide to just tune in? I mean, I'm aware I'm basically minuscule, so I'm not going to go like, "What? You didn't come here because you're interested in me?" Well, yeah. To be fair, I do know about this subject to a degree, but it was covered. I don't actually know a lot of the details, so yes, it is. Oh, so you do know a bit about it. Yes, the the Tupolev 4. Before that, the B4, which was, named that because of, Stalin recognized Tupolev's things. Well, then you probably know more than me. But this just covered stuff like how, although it's not often talked about, during the Second World War, Stalin kept encouraging the Allies to continue bombing, like, Germany. Even though modern-day Russia says, "Oh my God, Russia, like America and the British, are horrible. They destroyed so many cities." But meanwhile, as I said, let's see, with a number of the things here, it's just like, I salute the British Air Force, like, Your message informing me of the successful bombing of Hamburg received. I salute the British Air Force and welcome your intention to increase bomber attacks on Germany. It also covers a lot of other facts, like how the UN. Well, yes, although while I do feel that they aren't as critical of Japan as they need to these days, and it's sort of a problem because they have a shrine in Japan which is literally dedicated to a bunch of soldiers who were committing tons and tons of war crimes, and if you try to say anything about that you'll be attacked. Also, the fact that Japan, with the exception of the damage that was done during the war, basically got off scot-free after the Second World War. Now, although I'm not going to talk, like, people will argue that the nuclear bombs and the fire bombings were horrible, which they were. Absolutely, they were disgusting. However, you have to understand that even after all of that, there were people in Japan who were saying, I'm willing to kill every civilian we have to prove a point rather than, properly surrendering. When the emperor tried to surrender, a bunch of people in the military tried to arrest him. Also, the fact that we didn't punish Japan as heavily because, well, we needed a place to be able to observe and retaliate if the USSR did anything. And Japan happened to be perfectly situated right where we needed them. Yeah. Well, I like learning about World War II is a fascinating time. Some of the best and worst examples of humanity existed during that time. And while there's technology that existed during that era, which some people didn't think would exist during that time, it's, I think, at the proper point in history where heroism still matters, and, one guy with enough chutzpah can actually make a difference without having to worry about aerial drones and all that other stuff. For a second there I didn't recognize it. Yes, it was I don't know if that's a specific one, but yes, the Russians did make a copy of the Concorde, and actually, the Concorde that crashed wasn't actually a real Concorde. It was the Russian copy, which is sort of fascinating. How a knockoff caused the demise of the actual aircraft that was, even though it was successful. If you really like learning about aviation history, I strongly recommend you try out this channel, Paper Skies. He is a Ukrainian. He's a Ukrainian person who grew up at the tail end of the USSR, and his father was a fighter pilot in the Air Force. So he had some very interesting experiences. Like, I'll just show you a little bit of his channel. He covers a lot of aircraft that don't get a ton of coverage in the West. I don't know where exactly you're from. Sir talks a lot, but yeah. Well, yes, but sometimes all you need is a slight decrease in your reputation. That's also how clear Pepsi, or Crystal Pepsi, was dealt with. Coke made a knockoff that was a diet drink. And although Crystal Pepsi was not a diet product, at the time, people thought diet products or diet soda sucked. And they were like, clear Coke tastes awful, so that must mean Crystal Pepsi's bad. Now, it doesn't mean much today because, it happened so long ago, who cares? But for the people who really enjoyed it, it was, it was literally a smear campaign through marketing. But yes, Paper Skies covers a lot of stuff, like how the design flaw of the Sukhoi, the Su-24, the various crashes, and a lot of stuff like various other things. Now, as a Ukrainian, his opinion isn't exactly the highest of Russia, especially in the modern era, as you can tell. I believe, yes. By the way, I'm also sorry, my knowledge of aircraft is a lot more limited. But, wait, where is the video, I think? Sorry. Because his father, I think, piloted one. It was a Russian ground attack aircraft. Wait, did they get rid of it? I thought he had more videos than this. One of the things that happened is that due to the fact that, well, YouTube isn't as profitable for channels like his, which cover war and stuff like that, he's uploaded a ton of, like, his content, or the lion's share of his content is now on a site called Nebula, which covers a lot more stuff, but the problem is you actually have to pay to watch Nebula. But yes, he did cover it, or I think he covered it. If the Frogfoot is the ground support aircraft that the Russians used. Oh, well, yes. I also believe it uses a bigger gun. The bullets it fires are larger than the bullets that the A-10 fires. Because I remember him covering it. I watched it a few years ago. Well, I feel like it was a few years ago. Yes, probably just a few years ago. But, oh yeah. Oh, yes, but the problem is that the round basically destroyed the aircraft, or would damage the aircraft for a very long time. It was so strong that it rattled the insides of the aircraft. Firing it too long could cause the equipment to get detached from the aircraft. Now, some people take the stuff I'm saying and go like, oh, Russian aircraft suck, or Russian aircraft are dumb. It's like, no. No, it's not. The Russian designers could make wonderful aircraft. But the problem is, when you get, a regime which cares more about the propaganda of the device, or, just trying to scare other people with it, and rushing it out as fast as possible, as well as the fact that a lot of the people cared more about getting it out than. Oh, really? I can think of one off the top of my head. Do you know about the God, I forgot what it's called. The flying. Some guy tried to portray a flying armored transport. Like, let's see. Sorry, my headphones got stuck on my chair when I moved back. My keyboard is in my desk, so I have to pull it out. Let's see. Laser pig. Gavin. Okay. Okay, so the flying tanks. The genius of Mike Sparks. Oh, yes, absolutely. The advent of missiles basically rendered armor useless. I mean, before that, they were starting to get useless. There are various aircraft during the Second World War, like the Mosquito is a great example of putting guns on aircraft was pointless. I mean, well, yeah, I mean, on bombers. Also, the ironic thing is the Mosquito was a wooden aircraft. One second, I am not sure if I recognize the L2 designation, the IL2. So let's see, paste. Ah. Oh God, I'm being flashbanged by. It does not have a dark setting, but let's see. Oh, wait, is this? Okay, so wait, is that like? Well, yes. Or wait, I'm feeling stupid because isn't that a Mustang? Because, like, I. One second. I'm going to just go to Google and then do IL2. Oh, yes, the Illusion. Yeah, that last one was sort of confusing. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I figured. But, yes. But basically, with the advent of advanced anti-aircraft defenses, as well as, having missiles. Well, yeah, but there's also other aircraft, like the Cobra is also an interesting aircraft because the Americans built it. They hated the Cobra because they didn't really use it. Meanwhile, the Soviet. Oh, you don't know about that? 1 second. Go to. Okay, not operate. 1 second, plane. I forgot the exact designation. The Bell P-39 Air Cobra. It's a aircraft from the U.S. that, yeah, it fired a small tank round, which is kind of crazy. Oh yeah, straight in the thing. And it had so many neat factors. Like as you can see here, it has like a car door. And the reason for that is because this whole part here is filled up with a gun. And the pilot is basically sitting on the gun. The entire barrel basically went through here. If I remember correctly, yeah. 1 second. Sorry, trying to, nope. Trying to look at the chat and it's not cooperating. I have a problem which I'm very bad at remembering numbers. So, I'm good at remembering facts, but I'm terrible at remembering dates. Oh, wait, no, never mind. This is, sorry about that. Yeah, of course. The German jet, or rather, one of them. Which, yeah, why did I forget about that? I'm sorry about that. That was dumb of me. Yeah, the cannon on that. It's... Oh, yeah. Although it's one of those things where it was, released too little, too late. By the time it was in full production, Germany didn't have enough skilled pilots to really take advantage of it, and due to the serious loss of fuel and all that other stuff, it was, not used to the best thing. And the fact that somebody using a horribly outdated aircraft managed to shoot one down. It was, if I remember correctly, one of the air kills that was performed on the ME-262 was done by a Tuskegee airman who, yeah, Oh, yes. People talk about Germany being more advanced because they had so many interesting or weird projects being done. But when you don't have a lot of money and don't have a lot of resources left, wasting all your resources on a bunch of super weapons is pointless. A lot of people go like, "Oh, if only." Well, the V2 was useless as a, you know, tactical weapon because I mean, although regardless of how revolutionary it was, because, you could pick a city in a country and target it, and you definitely hit somewhere in that city. But if you wanted to hit a specific target within that city, then yeah, no. Absolutely. People love the idea of massive weapons because they think that they're better or all the other stuff, but really all they do is just say, "Oh, are you trying to create a diversionary attack? Well, there are several places this could come from. Where are they going to really attack? Where's the big thing that they can't hide going? Because that's probably where they're actually going to try to attack." You can only really the only time, in my opinion, that having an oversized military asset has worked is the Nimitz class and the Gerald Ford class of U.S. supercarriers. Because, well, they provide a lot of benefit, and not many countries have the stupidly huge military budget of the United States. People wonder why we don't have health care. It's because of our military. Now, having said that, one of the other reasons why the rest of the world, like the EU, can afford to keep their health care so great is because the American military has bases in their country and often will, patrol the areas around them. As a result, they don't need to spend as much money on their military budget. Now, I'm not saying other countries don't have good militaries, but as much as Europe talks about America policing the world, I'm not sure. A lot. Especially considering he was flying a triplane. 1 second. It's not cooperating. "80 enemy aircraft." Oh, yeah. Oh, well, yeah. Although, well, it says officially. The hard thing, the reason why it can be so difficult to properly gauge how many losses actually occurred in certain wars is that intelligence at this point wasn't great, and there are plenty of times where a pilot would shoot another aircraft, it would be smoking and it would look like it was starting to go down, but the pilot would go, "Yeah, I've shot down the aircraft," land. Meanwhile, the plane that was shot would actually manage to get to a base, land properly, and be fixed. In World War II, it's especially terrible. Because, allow me to enlighten you as to the difference between how the Allies and how the Germans recorded their losses. Now, for the Allies, I mainly know that I don't know if the Americans did this, but the British did this. At the end of a day, they would look to see how many tanks they had, or certain vehicles they had, And when they would look in and see, okay, we have this many here. They would look to see how many that they had and say, okay, these are in good condition and these are in need of repair. And then these probably need a much, much more time to repair. So they need to be sent to a depot to fix it properly. So they label the ones sent to a depot as a loss. And if there was a tank formation or a group of vehicles that was out at the time, they would also label that as a loss or unaccounted for. So when the vehicles that needed more repair were sent to a dedicated depot, they would be looked over again. And if they could be repaired, then they would be sent back. But if they could not be repaired, then they were labeled further as a loss, which may mean that the same vehicle might be counted twice, at least twice in the case of losses. And the British just wrote this down and kept doing it. As you can imagine, that would make it count as, just 1 second, fixing my model because it's currently leaning forward weirdly. I'm sorry, I have ADHD and I move around a lot, so my model tends to shift around weirdly. Now, as you can imagine, that might inflate your losses by quite a noticeable extent. Now, for the Germans, what they would do is they hated listing any losses because they wanted to apply it for propaganda purposes. So let's say that there's a vehicle that's been damaged to the point of where it can no longer operate, but it can still drive. The Germans will not label that, I'm calling them the Germans because if I use the other term, then I could be have my content blocked. But they would label it as in perfect condition. And even when they lost a vehicle, they would still sometimes refuse to list it as being inoperable. There are cases in which a unit that's a tank division would have no more vehicles and would only be a bunch of guys, drivers and, commanders acting as infantry. But on paper, their division is still 100% intact because they did not like listing their losses for propaganda purposes. Also, the fact that the superior Aryan, like SS, although people talk about them as if they are, proof of the goals of the strange Austrian man with a bad mustache, were better than the regular soldiers, which, they received the best training, they received the best uniforms, they received the best equipment, and they were often outperformed by the common German military. So, of course, that was unacceptable according to their, beliefs that they were trying to push. And as a result, they would inflate the numbers of it. Show it like it wasn't 20 or that. They didn't destroy like 5 units. They destroyed 10, which is why oftentimes, according to the German numbers of vehicles that they shoot down, they've apparently shot down, like in some cases, like twice the number of vehicles that the Allies ever had. And one of the other problems is that for a lot of history, they tend to cover or use German propaganda from the time as fact. rather than as what it clearly is, propaganda. Plus, after the war, a lot of German commanders wanted to, get a job as a UN military advisor. So they started writing books. And of course, in all of their books, they blamed their losses not on their ineptitude, but on top of, the leader or something else. When quite often it's shown, if you actually look into the battle records, that they were often going on their own. Some commanders refused to talk to other commanders just because they didn't like them. Rommel is a great example. He was portrayed as a noble, heroic, great general, which, if you actually look into the real facts about him, he was not. He oftentimes didn't like his superiors and was cut communications with them until he inevitably lost all of his resources and fuel and ammunition, at which point he would beg them to give him more stuff. And he did so well because his opponent was a British officer who, after World War I, was traumatized by the sheer volume of losses of the First World War. So he refused to fully commit to fight Rommel. When he was replaced by, God, I forgot his name. Montgomery. Is it Montgomery? General. Yeah. Yes, him. General Bernard Montgomery. When he replaced the old general, he immediately started wiping out, Rommel and his forces immediately. It's kind of messed up that we keep applying, whenever we talk about the Third Reich, we always use their propaganda as sources of information to sort of pump them up. The main reason is because, the tougher you make an opponent seem, the better it makes you look. Because even though he was like that, we made them we beat them. It's just like the Third Reich was, if you look at all their terrible decisions and all the stuff that went on, they were a clear mess, and they would have lost anyway. Before you came on, I mentioned that some people say that, even if America didn't get involved in the war, that the war would have been won, which is, if America didn't get involved in combat ever, the war still would have been won by the Allies. The problem comes that if America didn't get involved, period, if America never got involved at all in the war, then it would have been lost. And I'm not trying to say that as an American and go like, America, fuck yeah. I'm saying that because Lend-Lease, the main reason why Britain was able to, survive the long British engagement, the long, attacks from the Germans, is because America kept saying tons and tons of ships full of resources and vehicles. Because one thing that's not often talked about, because a lot of people I'm sorry, I have ADHD, so I apologize for constantly shifting to various different topics. A lot of people speak negatively of the French during the Second World War, which isn't very fair. Out of all the people who, technically won World War I, the French were the only ones to seriously take the threat of Germany. They built the Maginot Line, which is one of the most fortified at the time, was one of the most fortified walls and defensive structures in history up until that point, along the border between Germany and France. Now, they built, and on top of that, a lot of their tanks were actually, for the time, really advanced. They had radios, and they had a number of. Oh, well. I don't know if they left, because it shows like I only have one viewer again. And I've lost a viewer. Well, I don't know if you're still around to Talks a Lot, because you said you're interested in planes, and I just kept going into other stuff. I guess now that I'm not actually talking to someone, I'll go back to the video proper. Man, it's getting hot.
It was from there units in 1942, for example, in Vladivostok. This would have enabled US bombers to reach Japan without waiting several years, spending enormous amounts of military resources, and most importantly, losing tens of thousands of American, British, and other soldiers' lives before capturing the Mariana Islands. It was from there that the B-29 bombers were finally able to reach Japan, which ultimately became one of the decisive moments of World War II. However, even then, the missions for the B-29s were almost at the...
I'm going to turn off my audio for a bit so I can use the fan. And I don't want the fan to be constantly running on here, so I'll stop it when I actually say something. But it's getting really hot in my room. Alright, so I'll just continue.
Limit of their flight range, so American bombers damaged during the mission had little chance of returning to American bases and instead headed for the closer Soviet territory for emergency landings. But since the USSR was not at war with Japan, all these American bombers and their crews, who I remind you were direct allies of the USSR, were arrested and placed in internment camps where they were held until the very end of the war. Most importantly, the USSR refused to return the bombers, 3 of which were the most advanced of the time, the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. For Comrade Stalin, it was literally a heavenly gift falling from the skies.
Yeah, as I was starting to say before, at the time, like, imagine if they were actually allowed to make bases in, or well, not make, but just operate from Soviet bases. So many Marines, so many like Navy personnel would have, survived. But instead, Russia was outright helping Japan by allowing them to get gas and coal from their territory. And after they stopped doing that, they were straight up providing money to Japan. The only time Russia started to actually, or the Soviet Union started to actually attack the Japanese is after the Americans were about to start a land invasion, or when it looked like the Americans were going to do a land invasion of Japan proper. At which point then the Russians were just like, haha, fuck you, Japan, and started, a land invasion of the Japanese territories that were still around on China, and were basically heading towards trying to invade Japan themselves. And the reason Japan surrendered is not because of, for example, the Russians say the Japanese surrendered because of the threat of the Russian army. And Americans say that Japan surrendered because of the threat of the nuclear bombs. The answer is they surrendered for both reasons. For the people in mainland Japan, they were horrified by the nuclear bombs and their power. Especially since they were like, oh my god, you dropped one. I bet you don't have another one. And they dropped another one. And then they were just like, oh, okay, too. Well, I guess you don't have another. And then Truman was like, We have another one. We're going to keep doing this until you surrender. So the people in mainland Japan were terrified and wanted to surrender for that. Meanwhile, the Japanese army did not care about the nuclear bombs because they were just like, we are in territory of their allies. I bet they're not going to drop one of those bombs on us, so we can continue fighting. Because through the propaganda that the Japanese military made, they were just like, no surrender ever. And commit tons and tons of war crimes. Like, Jesus Christ, people try to act like the Japanese military was full of honor. Like, no, it wasn't. They talk about honor, and then, anyone who did very well against them, they just get angry, call them honorless, and then just still brutally kill them. It was a very self-serving system. But either way, the Japanese army was terrified of the waves and waves and waves of the Russian army coming to get them, because they knew that the Russians didn't give a shit about honor or not fighting dirty. Meanwhile, the Americans did try to fight according to the Geneva Convention. Which, it's easy to play a game if somebody has to stick to the rule, if one side has to stick to the rules, while you can just break them all. So, that's one thing. But either way, it's the combined fact of both of those, of the threat of the Russian army and the nuclear bombs, which caused Japan to ultimately surrender.
The Soviets first became aware of the American B-29 program when Eddie Rickenbacker made his trip to the USSR in June 1943. He briefly mentioned a new heavy bomber in development in a friendly conversation with his Russian interpreter, who, what a surprise, was also a Secret Service officer. The Soviets started to gather all available information, and soon in the same year of 1943, the renowned Soviet aircraft engineer Andrei Tupolev was tasked with developing a draft project for a heavy, high-altitude 4-engine bomber. In other words, creating a bomber comparable in performance to the American B-29 aircraft. By August 1944, the aircraft project was ready, and a month later,
I don't think I'll be able to get into any fat electrician videos. I am only 9 minutes into this one. Alright, just sorry to say that.
Full-scale model of the bomber, designated the Aircraft 64, was built and even tested in a wind tunnel. In April 1945, the Aircraft 64 draft was approved by a state commission. On June 5, 1945, Tupolev was summoned to the Kremlin to meet with Joseph Stalin. Tupolev was convinced that the discussion would be about Aircraft 64, so he brought with him a colorful album containing the designs and data about the new bomber. However, it turned out that the album was not needed. There's an amusing legend about this meeting, which is featured in nearly all modern Russian documentaries. Joseph Stalin asked Tupolev what he knew about the Boeing B-29 and his opinion of the aircraft. After hearing Tupolev's thoughts, Stalin informed him of the task to completely copy the American bomber. Tupolev reportedly replied that he could make an even better bomber, to which Stalin retorted, "Don't make it better. Just make it the same." On the day after the meeting, the State Defense Committee issued a resolution tasking Tupolev's design bureau with organizing the production of the B-4 aircraft, an exact Soviet copy of the American B-29 bomber. For replicating such a complex machine, Stalin generously allotted Tupolev just 1 year, and 1 more year to build the first 20 bombers so they could take part in the 1947 aviation parade. Many has been written about the process of the Soviet copying the Boeing B-29, but perhaps the most interesting and comprehensive account comes from Leonid Kerber, one of the Andrei Tupolev's deputies who was directly involved in creating the Soviet copy of the American bomber. After the 3 American B-29s that had made emergency landings in the Soviet Far East were flown to Moscow, Tupolev and his team went to the airfield to inspect the Americans. According to Kerber's recollections, Tupolev examined and touched everything he could on the B-29, even attempting to crawl through the tunnel connecting the pressurized cabins. However, being a bit stout, he got stuck. He chuckled and remarked, "This is made for scrawny Americans. They probably don't get enough to eat under capitalism." I have to say, I can't help but point out this amazing joke by Tupolev. Just to remind you that in 1946, when the joke was made, the Soviet Union was already suffering from a horrible famine, which resulted in approximately 2 million Soviet people dying of hunger between 1946 and 1948. And the worst is that the USSR had sufficient grain reserves to save those people, not to mention that it even continued to export grain abroad during those years. Just imagine for a second, 2 million people dead without any war. Just this single episode of the brilliant Soviet leadership caused twice as many deaths as all the Allied casualties in Europe throughout World War II. So a great joke indeed, and the fact that it is constantly depicted in every Russian documentary about Tupolev as funny historical episode only proves that, I agree with Russians when they call themselves a unique God-chosen nation. They are indeed unique, only in a completely opposite sense from what they think. Anyway, after wrapping up the jokes and finishing inspecting the B-29, Andrei Tupolev shared his thoughts that the aircraft design had nothing unique or unfamiliar to him and that building such a machine would not be particularly difficult. However, when Tupolev began to think aloud about the challenges of replicating the aircraft's equipment and armament, any trace of humor disappeared completely. Tupolev decided to completely disassemble one B-29 down to the smallest possible bits, using all its parts to create detailed drawings and then make their exact copies. The second aircraft was to be used for obtaining the bomber's flight specifications and training flight crews. The third B-29 was to be preserved intact as a reference model. Tupolev appointed Dmitry Markov as the chief engineer for the overall project, as noted in Kerber's book, due to Markov's previous experience with the brilliant production launch of the American Vultee V-11 aircraft. This, by the way, is a very interesting point which we will discuss in more detail at the end of the video. So the American aircraft was disassembled into separate structural independent parts, each of which was assigned to an individual engineer with his own team. Each part was then gradually disassembled into smaller parts. In other words, the aircraft was literally gradually disassembled down to the last bolt. All parts were documented, meticulously photographed, weighed, registered, and underwent spectral analysis to determine their material properties. The same principle applied to all wires and tubes connecting those parts. As a result, a huge album of sketches was prepared, which became the basis for further work designing structural elements and developing working drawings. In total, several tens of thousands of working drawings were completed. All the parts obtained after disassembly were then sent to appropriate factories and laboratories for further analysis and copying. Although it was a long and time-consuming process, the hardest part was still ahead. It was determined that the vast majority of technological solutions and materials used in the B-29 were entirely new to Soviet aircraft production. The metal sheets, plates, pressed and bent sections, fasteners, and up to 90% of the materials had never been used or produced by either the aviation or metallurgical industries before. The technological process of aircraft manufacturing and assembly were also new and largely unknown. Indeed, to produce such a bomber, it wasn't just Tupolev's bureau that needed to adapt. All Soviet industries directly or indirectly related to aircraft production had to advance to next level. The involvement of an enormous number of research and production organizations from different industrial sectors, multiplied by the Soviet bureaucracy, became one of the first serious challenges for Tupolev and threatened to significantly slow down, if not completely stop, the overall process of building the new aircraft. One might question Andrei Tupolev's talent specifically as an aircraft engineer, but what was beyond doubt were his excellent skills as a manager, a Soviet manager to be precise, since they could only be effectively applied within the Soviet system. Encountering this problem, Tupolev managed to get the top leadership to ensure that each Soviet ministry would assign special representatives to be responsible for the work on the bomber. And these representatives were appointed at the highest possible level, usually being the deputy ministers or heads of industry departments. This greatly accelerated the process and, to be fair, should be deservedly credited to Tupolev, as otherwise the Soviet bomber would probably never have appeared, or would only have been completed after a huge delay. What is interesting is that these ties built between various Soviet ministries and Tupolev's design bureau continued to exist unofficially even after the completion of work on the Tu-4 bomber, becoming a huge advantage for Tupolev on future projects. According to Kerber's recollections, whenever Tupolev encountered problems with the supply of certain components, equipment, and assemblies for his new aircraft, the issues were usually resolved very quickly thanks to these direct connections, whereas for other design bureaus, this often became a significant problem.
Oh my god! What? Preferential treatment? In the Soviet Union? No, that can't possibly be, because don't you know everyone's supposed to be equal? That's only an issue that occurs in, non-communist countries.
However, Tupolev's initiative still did not protect the new Soviet bomber from the so-called Russian mentality of blind execution, which had been honed for decades by Comrade Stalin's effective management in the form of cruel repressions. Every participant in the new bomber's production was acutely aware of Stalin's order to strictly and precisely copy the B-29, with no deviations from the American aircraft allowed in any detail. And as obedient Stalinists, they followed the order exactly, often leading to failures and problems that might seem funny and even ridiculous, if not for the terrifying reality of the Soviet system. For example, the first such incident occurred with the armament. It was obvious from the beginning that all the weapons on the new aircraft should of course be Soviet, which was respectively noted in the aircraft specifications. But knowing that Stalin would not tolerate delays, this specification for the new bomber was hastily prepared and the detailed specification for the armament was not made. So when the matter was addressed more closely, it turned out that behind the armament itself, the bombs and machine guns, there was also quite a long trail of other parts and details, like bomb blocks, bomb release mechanism, turret rotation motors, ammunition belts and boxes, you name it. Even the targeting sights needed to be different from those on the B-29, as the ballistics of American and Soviet bombs and bullets were not the same. Anywhere else but the Soviet Union, such problem might not even exist. However, in this case, quiet discussions began regarding those smaller details. So, are we copying the Boeing or not?
One other thing to keep in mind is that, for a lot of the Russian equipment, and especially with regards to ammunition, especially at this time, it was inconsistent because different workers would put different effort. There would be different amounts of powder. Sometimes that powder was old, sometimes that powder was, made of cheaper stuff. So standardization wasn't very good. And there was a lot of variances between the different armaments and, the Russian rounds were very inconsistent. Especially, as I said, especially during this time. With most American weapons, you could just fire regularly, while, some people say Russian weapons are very rugged. Well, they're often made cheaply, and they're sort of made with the idea that their rounds are highly acidic and not the best. So that's why when you use Russian ammunition in non Russian weapons, it can cause problems. Not that I think a lot of people knew about that, but whatever.
Not. Remembering Stalin's strict order for every minor deviation from the original assignment, each participant in the process began now to demand a signed document releasing them from responsibility. But issuing such a document would also mean a deviation from the assignment, and no one wanted to take that risk either. The entire process was quickly heading toward a dead end. As Kerber recalled, eventually a new foundational document was issued with a large number of big signatures from various ministries and departments. However, all this was resolved so terribly slowly, with awful nerve-wracking delays, and most importantly, it was hindering the release of the drawings. But after solving one problem, another arose, this time with the IFF system. It seemed obvious that the new Soviet bomber should be equipped with the Soviet system, already adopted by the Red Army. However, since this was not specified in the main document, the radio technology industry produced equipment for the new bomber that was a direct copy of the American IFF system. And that system was the one installed on the first aircraft. The potential consequences were easy to imagine. If a Soviet fighter equipped with a Soviet IFF system encountered a Tu-4 bomber with the American IFF system and did not receive a proper friend or foe response, the fighter would very likely open fire on the bomber immediately. Couldn't this have been foreseen? It could have been, and it was, of course. But as Kerber wrote in his book, the fear overcame everything, including common sense, and the only consideration left was that leadership knows best. Another amusing example was the parachute.
Which, that's always very interesting. Which, is a great time to develop weapons when you're afraid of trying anything new and just try to do everything according to the leadership out of fear of getting killed or put into a prison. Yes, indeed. Oh, this project won't work because of this thing here. No, we have to continue making it. It doesn't matter if thousands of people die because of the fact that this thing is unreliable. We need it. We can't say that it doesn't. The premier has shown it in documents and talked about it. We can't embarrass the premier. We have to continue.
The American B-29 crew had their parachutes in backpacks, which served as a sort of soft backrest for their seat while on board the plane. Meanwhile, the Soviet Air Force were still using the so-called seat parachutes, which served as a cushion that the pilot sits on. That's why the seats in all Russian aircraft were made cup-shaped, so to accommodate these seat parachutes. And so, once again, the Soviet engineers faced the question, if we copy flat seats from the B-29, should we then introduce special backpack parachutes for the new bomber, a copy of the American ones? As Kerber recalled, everyone agreed that doing that would be stupid, and yet when it came to real actions, everyone demanded signed documents to make this simple change in seats. As Kerber said, no one wanted to end up in Siberia. Everyone knew that some honest Soviet citizen would inevitably report that his co-worker was violating Comrade Stalin's order. A similarly ridiculous situation occurred with the bomber's radio receiver. Through the Lend-Lease program, the Soviet Union had been receiving various American aircraft, including B-25 bombers, which by 1945 were equipped with more advanced radio receivers compared to those found on the B-29s that had crashed a year earlier. It seemed obvious that the new Soviet bomber should be equipped with these newer, more advanced radio receivers. The deputy minister of the Soviet electronics industry, Ivan Zubovich, fully agreed with Tupolev's engineers in that regard, but refused to proceed without official approval from the Air Force. Meanwhile, the Air Force representative, the renowned General Sergei Danilin, responded, "Absolutely, this new radio receiver is exactly what we need, but I cannot give my official consent." As Kerber noted in his book, after nearly 3 years of close interactions with numerous ministries and industry departments, he observed that the vast majority of Soviet workers on every level fell into the category of so-called blunt executors. Constrained by the strict order to copy the American bomber, they preferred simply to do their work and not to worry about the various problems that arose. even when those issues appear to be important, if not critical, to the overall success of the project. Aside from the problem of blunt execution, there was another significant issue of a totally different kind: the measurement units. As you know, the US uses the imperial system, while the Soviet Union uses the metric system. I have to say, this is probably the only area where the USSR was much better than the United States. Sorry, my American friends. Anyway, the difference in units became a huge headache for Tupolev's engineers and the Soviet industry's capabilities. For example, they determined that the thickness of the B-29 skin was 1/16 of an inch, which, when converted to the metric system, equals to 1.5875 meters.
I also just realized that on my chat stream, it does not show that Sir Talks-A-Lot said that he had to leave due to, well, he had to go because of a random, he had to go. So I didn't notice that because it didn't appear on my chat stream. But I checked on Twitch proper, and it does say that. Because sometimes I can't see any, reactions, or I don't see certain chat messages on my end. So I apologize if I don't respond and people are saying things, because I can't really see them on chat occasionally. But either way, I'll continue now.
Millimeter. But no Soviet factory could roll metal sheets with a precision to thousandths of millimeters, so the engineers had to round it. However, if they rounded the number up to the nearest possible standard of 1.6 millimeter, then the aerodynamic engineers started to protest, as that would lead to a weight increase, and thus they couldn't guarantee the required aircraft speed, altitude, and range characteristics. On the other hand, when rounding down to 1.5 millimeter, then the structural engineers objected, as they couldn't guarantee the strength characteristics. The issue was resolved in a Soviet engineering matter. Depending on the calculated load on each particular part of the bomber, they either increased the thickness of the skin or made it thinner. As a result, the Tu-4 fuselage thickness in different places ranged from 0.8 to 1.8 millimeter. There were also difficulties that seemed small, yet according to Kerber, still managed to slow down the work. The American bomber came with a pile of various manuals and instructions that obviously had to be translated into Russian for Soviet airmen to use. The problem was that the aircraft engineers didn't know English, which is why translators were brought in. However, although these translators spoke English perfectly well, they had little to no understanding of engineering and aviation concepts. As a result, as Kerber noted, the engineers had to spend their evenings after work editing these translations. He also mentioned that they couldn't help but admire how the American authors of the manuals conveyed information to the readers concisely and comprehensively, while Soviet bureaucratic language, as he put it, laid like logs blocking the road. For example, one of the pre-flight checks in the manual said, "Start the putt-putt." As Kerber noted, they spent an enormous amount of time going through all available books, dictionaries, and encyclopedias trying to find out what that putt-putt was.
I'll tell you a short story after this little segment.
But found no answer. It was only when the very first Soviet bomber was built and they were getting it ready for flight that they figured it out. When they started an auxiliary power unit, it made the sound put 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 put. So what was in the manual was simply an imitation of the engine's exhaust sound. But the Soviet manual, as Kerber joked, was no place for childish memes, and what was clearly explained in the American manual in just one sentence, in the Russian manual turned into... Sorry, I'm not sure I can properly read it. But despite the slow...
I will try and read it. Well, let's see.
Explained in the American manual in just one sentence, in the Russian manual turned into...
For this purpose, you must start the auxiliary power unit, which consists of a two-cylinder, two-stroke, air-cooled gasoline engine that drives a four-pole DC generator with compound excitation, which provides power to the aircraft's electrical systems when the main engines are not operating. Ah, yes, clearly. If any layman can understand that, absolutely. Yes, I know that in fact too. I'm not just trying to say I understand what it means because I'm afraid of people judging me as stupid. Totally, totally not. By the way, this isn't the first time that an Americanism has, caused other people a great amount of time and confusion. During the Second World War, during the God, I forgot what it. How can I forget the name of the battle? Either way, during a time when the American military was under a good amount of pressure, um, the well, basically, the Germans told the Americans that they must surrender. At which point, the American general in charge was like, nuts, nuts. It was just like, and at which point, the Germans got that, and they were just like, what? Nuts? What? Huh? And they could try to sorry. They were frantically trying to figure out what they meant. Was it a sign of surrender? Was it that? When it was actually just at the time a term for them to say basically screw that, which is like nuts. But to the others, like what? Huh? What? What do they mean by that? What is this? Is this a mistranslation? Is this something? And they were just horribly, horribly confused, which actually bought time for the Americans to reinforce their positions. But that's just a fun little thing.
Sorry, I'm not sure I can properly read it. But despite the slowdowns and setbacks, the work continued, and eventually all the drawings and preparations were completed. The aircraft construction phase finally began. However, tensions were only growing as Stalin's deadlines crept closer and closer. Stress reached its peak when the aircraft was finally built at the Kazan Aviation Factory. There is a well-known case when the deputy director of the Kazan factory, Leonid Baklunov, refused to sign the documents authorizing the first flight test, believing that the aircraft was still not ready. Unable to withstand the immense pressure from his superiors, Baklunov tragically took his own life. In the HR department, there is still a record about Leonid Baklunov saying dismissed on April 19th due to death. But, of course, such trivial matters could not stop the execution of Stalin's order, and on May 19th, 1947,
And of course, only a free and superior system as communism could make it so that a person would kill themselves out of fear of their leader's wrath. Absolutely, communism is clearly the best system. I'm not trying to say that capitalism isn't the best. Capitalism is still terrible, and modern day capitalism is not true capitalism. It's basically a bastardized version of it. But even in this currently bastardized form of capitalism, money is still valuable. So, in a communist society, you can, if you're in a lower position, if you can't really rise yourself above outside of a person in a higher power basically allowing you to. Meanwhile, if you're poor in a capitalist society, you can acquire money, and that money will still be worth something. Also, there's the little fact that during the time of the USSR, they were being bankrolled by the Americans and the West, which isn't really covered. Communism can exist when it's being supplied or funded by other countries. Doesn't that sound great? Even Karl Marx, the man who made the book, who literally wrote the book on communism, basically survived because he had a patron who was paying for everything for him. So, yes, clearly the person who didn't need to worry about money is the guy who should be writing about a system which you don't use money.
As pilot Nikolai Rybko took the new bomber into the air. To everyone's relief, the first flight was successful and didn't reveal any serious problems. However, you
Also, of course, I'm going to tell you this. Most communist societies have the same issue where, I mean, also our modern capitalist society is starting to have this happen too, because it's starting. What I'm about to talk about is starting to decline. Now, when everyone is paid the same wage, or gets the same amount of stuff for doing the same work, no matter how good or how bad you are. Like, imagine if you spent, like, from morning till night working hard, barely taking any breaks, doing a really good job, and then you still got the same amount of money as the guy who stayed there the same amount of time as you, but was mostly on break, slacked off, and just barely did the bare minimum of what was required of him. Now, some people can work for a bit longer by doing that, but after a certain amount of time, it wears away at your will, and you're just like, there is literally no benefit to me working harder if I'm being paid the same exact amount as somebody who's barely doing their job. Why am I wasting my time with this? Especially if there's no real way for you to, improve. All communist societies tend to be very, very corrupt. I mean, capitalist societies are too, but a lot of people try to act like, how can you possibly be corrupt if there's no money? Because there's other things of value that they take. There's a joke from the Soviet Union where, some people are more equal than others. And usually that means that, referring to the upper class, which, of course, is interesting because the USSR and communism are only supposed to be about, everyone being equal. But a number of people were considered of a higher class. They lived more comfortably and made a lot more of. There were marks, and then there's I don't know. The system is sort of fascinating in how contrived it is and how just deliberately flawed it is. But the one thing that they did well is their propaganda. It was very consistent, and they cut down on all the bad things going on. So even though they were in stagnation for many, many years, and suffering from a decline, they still acted like the people who lived during that time didn't realize that because all the propaganda was treating it as like, yes, everything's going great, nothing bad ever happens, and the news networks the people in charge of the news will be killed and their families tortured and sent to a godforsaken hole in the ground if they say otherwise. But yeah.
You can't say that the fears about the plane's readiness were entirely unfounded. There is an interesting description in that regard made by the famous Soviet test pilot Mark Galay, who took part in the test flights of the very first Tupolev Tu-4s. In his book,
Man, his nose kind of reminds you of Anthony Bourdain. Nose and eyes sort of remind me of Anthony Bourdain. Of the late Anthony Bourdain. Sorry about
he
that.
mentioned his conversation with Rybko after his first flight on the Tu-4. And I like how he answered the question about the aircraft equipment. Can you imagine? It seems to work, said Rybko. At least those pieces that we have turned on so far. That's encouraging, replied Galai, and I can't really say whether he was expressing his true feelings or subtle sarcasm. Right after the first Tu-4 bomber was built, the second and then the third quickly followed. All three bombers were set to participate in the 1947 air parade in Moscow, where they would be demonstrated to Western observers for the very first time. Both Mark Galay and Leonid Kerber described in their books a funny episode that occurred on their way to Moscow. As they recall, they took off normally, but all of a sudden hot air started to pump into the cockpit. Mark Galay realized that after a few flights on the Tu-4, they had only learned the aircraft's primary control systems and he had no idea how the air conditioning worked. Fortunately for him, Leonid Kerber, a lead engineer from Tupolev's bureau who had designed and built this very plane, was on board, so Galay asked him to turn off the heat. However, it turned out that Kerber also had no knowledge of the air conditioning controls. He spent a lot of time searching for them, but alas, without success. As a result, as he recalled, by the time they were approaching Moscow, everyone on board had stripped down like sunbathers on the sandy beaches of Sochi. Interestingly, the Soviets decided not to bother with using the first completed bombers as prototypes to verify all system performances, as one would typically do when developing brand new aircraft. Instead, they immediately started serial production of a new aircraft. In some ways, this decision was justified, as the Soviet plane was an exact copy of an American bomber that had already been used successfully for several years. However, it was still a newly built aircraft and not everything went smoothly. Shortly after the air parade, the third bomber produced was lost due to engine fire. Of course, there were multiple issues, but the aircraft engines perhaps caused the most trouble, being unprecedentedly technologically complex. Here it's worth noting an important detail. The Asha-73 engines installed on the Soviet bomber was a Soviet design and not a copy of the ones from the B-29. Any similarities between the engines were because the Soviet and American engines had a common ancestor. Both of them were a further development of the American Wright Cyclone engine, which the Soviets had previously purchased under a license from the US and produced under the designation M25. In other words, Stalin was aware of the proper approach to purchasing a license rather than blatantly stealing technologies. Speaking of Stalin, it was he who in 1947 signed the Completion Act for the state tests of the new bomber, which was the only such case in the history of Soviet aviation. And it was while signing this act that Stalin personally corrected the bomber's original designation of B-4 to Tu-4, thereby acknowledging Andrei Tupolev's contributions in completing this difficult task. The aircraft was then launched into mass production and sent to the Air Force heavy bombardment units. In total, about 1,000 copies of the aircraft were built. On October 18, 1951, the Tu-4 bomber dropped the first Soviet atomic bomb at the Semipalatinsky test site. Stalin's goal was finally achieved. Although capable of carrying a nuclear weapon, the Soviet Tupolev Tu-4...
I was waiting for a good point to interject, but I might as well interject it now. I've been critical of a lot of the Soviet designs and equipment, but as I stated, one of the biggest issues for Soviet technology was the intervention of its leaders and the developers' fear of the leaders' reaction to their designs or their changes. What certain things on paper are excellent, like aircraft, or for example, the T-34 tank on paper is a great tank. But the problem with Soviet production is that very few vehicles that they design are actually, properly built as they are on paper. They are oftentimes built shoddily with some pretty unskilled labor. I mentioned earlier that due to the communist ideal of everyone being paid the same, as I mentioned, working harder doesn't mean that even if you work harder, you're still paid the same as somebody who slacks off. Which means that oftentimes their production lines were very unmotivated. I mean, they only felt, I mean, obviously they didn't stop working, but they didn't feel like they needed to put their heart and soul into everything because they just wanted to complete it to get the deadline done. They didn't want to do anything extra, just do exactly as you're told. But yes. So, on paper, the T-34 is a really good tank, but none of them were actually built according to their design specs. And oftentimes, they were produced, like, the T-34 is an expensive tank that was built cheaply during the Second World War. If you look into the actual stories about them rather than the propaganda spread about it, it's rather comical to hear all the things that were actually cut out of the tank, such as like radios, proper like telescopes so that they can see out of the tank and things like that. But other than that, no, sorry. All right, so I have about I don't know. I think I have enough time to finish this because I keep going on. I try not to interject too much, but I am being rather chatty, and it will oftentimes, Okay, I'm just gonna. Okay. Yeah. Oh my god, this is. No, I'm sorry. I'm trying to charge my phone. Because since my chat doesn't always. The chat I see on OBS doesn't always reveal everything, sometimes I have to look on, my phone to make sure that I can actually see because, like, it'll cut out certain lines. But either way.
Or never became a real threat to the United States, as its flight range was still insufficient to reach U.S. territory. However, despite this, the Tu-4 held enormous significance for the USSR. As stated in all Russian books, articles, documentaries, and of course on Wikipedia, the development of serial production of the Tu-4 bomber enabled Soviet heavy aircraft manufacturing to transition to a new, more technologically advanced level in the shortest possible time. And here the most interesting question arises: how? How could a country that was so far behind the United States in terms of aviation, weaponry, electronics, and other technologies manage to create such a complex aircraft? If you're Russian, the answer to this question is very simple. Everything was done thanks to the wise, strong-willed decision of the great comrade Stalin, followed by an unmatched feat of labor by the Russian people, which once again proved that there is nothing impossible for this greatest nation of all. And for the Russian audience, such an explanation of yet another myth of Russian greatness is enough. And not surprising, of course. As the expression goes, life is easier when you are Russian. So what made the Tu-4 bomber possible then? Was Stalin's wise order and the availability of the American bomber to copy from really all that was needed? The short answer is of course no, and you don't need to take my word for it. Let's get back to Dmitry Markov, who, as noted in Kerber's book, was appointed chief engineer of the Tu-4 bomber project because of his previous experience overseeing the implementation of the American Vultee aircraft into production. And according to Kerber, Markov did not just simply make it, but he made it brilliantly. The Soviet Union in 1936 did indeed purchase a license to produce the American Vultee V-11, which in the USSR received the designation Basha-1. And the reason you have probably never heard of it is because of how brilliantly the Basha-1 was implemented into production. When the Soviets bought the license to the Vultee V-11, by American standards it was already far from being an advanced aircraft. To be fair though, the Russians understood this perfectly well, and their main reason for purchasing
The Volti as a combat aircraft is already outdated. The construction of the Volti aircraft in the USSR is intended to master the new aircraft manufacturing technology applied in this plane. If I remember correctly, since I've been sort of taking a dump on Russian aircraft, um, the Russians are one of the people who first designed, or the USSR or whatever, whichever, are one of the first to design what you think of as the traditional aircraft of this era, which is, the metal plane wings and an engine in front and sort of the canopy like that, as opposed to the biplanes and triplanes of World War One. As I said, though, the issue is that the great leader Stalin hated and distrusted intellectuals. And as a result, a lot of the brightest minds of the USSR were shipped to camps and either put to death or just rotted in gulags until they died. There were a lot of brilliant people in the USSR. It's just that they are often stifled by the regime or, not trusted by the regime. They cared more about being loyal to the political system and following your directions and don't do anything different. Just do exactly what we tell you to. Don't innovate. Don't do anything like that. The boat must be as stable as possible, and even if the boat is in a rough sea and is about to sink, we need to act as if it's perfectly smooth sailing. Which, as I said, is stifling if you're trying to be a creative or trying to innovate. Because a lot of the people are just in their position not because of competence, but because of political loyalty or things like that. That's not to say that they never did anything right or anything good, but the good that they did and a lot of the strengths that they had were in spite of the system rather than as a result of it.
in it was not to get a new plane, but to master the new aircraft manufacturing technology. But it turned out that implementing even such an outdated aircraft into production was beyond the Soviet capabilities. The Soviet-built planes appeared much heavier, less powerful, and on top of that with many defects, such as, for example, failure to retract landing gear or stuck bomb locks. And the phrase Soviet-built would also be quite an exaggeration, since the first 5 Basha-1s were not even built, but essentially assembled from parts supplied by Valty company. In other words, the Russians couldn't even properly assemble aircraft from parts made in America. Of course, this failure was not Dmitry Markov's fault alone, although it didn't save him from arrest in 1938 for sabotage and espionage. And it is in prison.
Oh, yes, and of course that would also happen. If it didn't succeed, even if, it wasn't your fault, the higher-ups want to find a scapegoat, so there it goes, your fault! No need to further look into this, no need to keep data on it to see what works and what doesn't work. We will continue as we were going before.
Where he started working with Andrei Tupolev along with other imprisoned engineers. As we can see from the Basha-1 example, the purchased production technology along with actual planes and parts, coupled with the wise order of Comrade Stalin, were not enough to copy the American plane. So then, how did pretty much the same people in just a few years manage to reorganize not only their own construction bureau, but the whole Soviet industry so to produce an incomparably more complex aircraft? What was the USSR missing in the late 1930s that in 1945 made possible such a powerful leap forward in Soviet technologies and production? The short answer is the Germans.
Yep.
As you probably know, after World War II ended, Germany, in order to compensate for the damage they inflicted, was obliged to pay war reparations to the Allied countries, including, of course, the USSR. The reparations were paid in various forms, such as currencies, precious metals, and resources, as well as the dismantling and transfer of industrial objects. Indeed, the Soviet Union was not the only one doing that. How
Yeah, they often, yes, it's true, but East Germany was nearly ruined because of how much of their industry and their talent had been taken back to Russia by the Soviets, or but to Moscow rather. Of course, a lot of people don't like talking about this, but yeah, it's well, whatever.
However, it was the only one doing it to such extent. During only 1 year from 1945 to 1946, before the war reparations were actually legalized by the Potsdam Conference, the USSR had already dismantled and transported to its territory more than 4,000 various industrial objects. Another significant part of the reparations that modern day Russia somehow remained silent about was forced labor provided by the German population. In total, more than 500,000 German civilians were deported from Germany and Eastern Europe to the USSR after World War II as forced laborers. But in the context of this video, more interesting is the so-called Operation Ost-Aviachim, a secret Soviet operation on October 22, 1946, under which more than 2,500 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, together with their family members, totaling more than 6,000 people, were transported from Germany to the Soviet Union. Upon arrival in the socialist
This is for Americans. This is basically the Russian equivalent of the US's Operation Paperclip, where we did the same exact thing, except most of the scientists came willingly. Actually, in the case of Werner von Braun, he actively searched for the Americans. He and the group of scientists avoided as many of the other factions, like the British and the French, and everyone who was not an American. They all avoided and hid from until they were sure that it was an American force, at which point they willingly went there to try and, get themselves taken to America. Because that way they felt they'd actually be safe and not suffer under, the Soviet Union. But either way.
paradise, the majority of German engineers were assigned to the Soviet Ministry of Aviation, developing planes as well as jet engines. The rest of the specialists were distributed among other industries such as armament production, radar and telecommunications, chemical industry. All those industries where coincidentally a year later the great Russian people would achieve an unprecedented technological leap forward while executing Stalin's task of replicating the American B-29 bomber. So the reality is it was not Stalin with his strong will and wise decisions, and certainly not the great Russian people, but rather the German engineers, often placed in supervisory positions over their Russian employees, who made possible that enormous leap of Soviet industry. The process of replicating the B-29 wasn't what started the rapid industry development, but was rather the first serious task to check the capabilities of the newly upgraded Soviet industry and its personnel previously delivered to the USSR from defeated Germany. And I know there will be a few mentally gifted viewers who will rush to the comments to say, but the Americans did the same. I know, they did. And the fact that you know that is precisely the difference between the free world and Russia. You see, Werner von Braun was presenting his rocket and space ideas on national TV as early as the 1950s and was openly recognized as the creator of the original German V-2 and American rockets that followed. Meanwhile, in Russia, even 70 years later, they still believe that all their scientific achievements are the result of sudden enlightenment and heroic feats of labor. You see, I'm not judging here the fact that the Soviets used German brains and labor in building their war machine. It was rough, evil, but nevertheless normal logic, so to say, of the country's war industry. The danger lies in drawing the wrong conclusions and misinterpreting such events. Unlike what you might think, the story of copying the American bomber is not a story kept secret in Russia. Quite the opposite, it is widely told, although always presented as a unique example of the technological achievements made possible due to the uniqueness of the Russian people, serving as yet another brick in the myth of Russian greatness. For decades, this self-deceptive myth has slowly grown, though it has largely remained confined within the borders of the so-called Russian world, as Western civilization has always been resilient to these ridiculous stories from the Russians, which sadly is not the case anymore. When, let's not name names, an influential American with a huge audience talks to the media about Russians and says that they defeated Hitler, they defeated Napoleon, they are a war machine, it is a frightening display of how these myths have taken hold. You see, this statement, Russians defeated Napoleon, exists exclusively in the Russian historical universe, the same universe that claims a rapidly advanced Soviet industry created a copy of the American B-29 bomber. For the rest of the world, Napoleon fought against a coalition of countries, with Russia being just one of its members, and the 1812 invasion of Russia was just one episode of the Napoleonic Wars. Moreover, at the epic 1815 Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon suffered his final defeat and which indeed marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Russians were not even present. As for the claim of defeating Hitler alone, when Vladimir Putin made such a statement during the Victory Day parade in 2021, it was widely regarded as complete nonsense from a delusional dictator. And it is terrifying that just 3 years later this statement is being repeated by someone who aspires to lead the land of the free. Interestingly, the myth of Russian greatness is so powerful that sometimes even Russian leaders fall victim to it. Take for example Nikita Khrushchev, who falsely believed in the capabilities of his nuclear submarine missile systems, a misconception that some believe may have influenced his decision to back off during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ironically, the source of his false belief was none other than Khrushchev's own commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy, Sergei Gorshkov. If you want to learn more about this fascinating episode, check out my video available exclusively on my streaming service Nebula. And if you're really into the history of the Soviet Union, you can explore my other videos as well, like the story of the so-called recoilless madness of the 1930s when the Soviets attempted to arm their fighters with absurdly large guns, or the amusing story of the Soviet MiG-21 that accidentally landed.
I'm going to continue playing this part of the ad because if you have a real interest in his content, then Nebula is where the majority of it is. But you have to pay for Nebula. But as a result, you get a much more... They're able to cover things on Nebula that YouTube won't allow you to cover or won't allow you to say. And the algorithm is sort of better at... the YouTube algorithm is fine for what it is, but if you want to learn history or certain things, it's not always the best. Especially for those history channels, because if they want to cover the full real history, they're not allowed to say certain things or talk about certain things, or they'll be demonetized, which, you know, considering the passion these people have, that's really bad. Although most people wouldn't want to have to pay for this type of content. But I would definitely say there's a lot more people interested. They just hear you have to pay for it, and they're like, no. But I'll just continue playing.
Landed on a NATO airfield, or the ghost flight story when an Antonov An-12 circled over a city for several hours with an entirely unconscious crew. I know I talk about Nebula all the time because Nebula isn't like other streaming platforms. It was founded and is owned directly by us, the creators. Nebula is genuinely the most sustainable way to support content creators. When you sign up with my link nebula.tv/paperskies, I will get a portion of your subscription fee for as long as you stay subscribed. But you will also get access to everything the platform has to offer, not just my videos. Nebula houses dozens of unique exclusive projects like Red Atoms by Real Time History, Underexposure by Neo, and Modern Conflicts by Real Life Lore, along with many more projects which otherwise wouldn't be possible since it's too risky to produce them for YouTube due to strict advertiser policies. On Nebula, we don't need to worry about that, simply because there are no ads or sponsorship messages there, which is why the number of such exclusive videos is growing every day. You can get access to Nebula with my link in the description, which gives Paper Skies fans an amazing 40% off an annual subscription, bringing the cost down to just $3 a month. Or you can choose a lifetime membership, which allows you to pay only once to get unlimited access forever. You can also now give Nebula as a gift with annual gift cards. Sign up using my link nebula.tv/paperskies to get 40% off an annual subscription and support my channel. And as always, thank you so much for watching.
No. Paper Skies is a very good channel to watch stuff on. Even if you don't go to Nebula, he has a number of very interesting videos. Such as, this one that we just covered, which I noticed a few people came in at the tail end of. There's the ridiculous design flaw of the Su-24, which, as you can see, has to do with the ejector seat, which I've seen. All of the free videos are on YouTube I have watched of his, and they're all really interesting. The design flaw and the fact that I'm going to spoil one part of the Su-24's design. Oops, sorry. I'm going to have to leave to go to work soon. That's why I have so many alarms going off, so I apologize. But even the modern day Su-24s that are still active in Ukraine and in the Russian military still have this same design flaw. They've just stuck on something that helps to mitigate the issue from occurring. And then, I'm not going to talk about it, but it is a rather fascinating story. There's the story of the pilots that fell asleep, or there's, the Russian, I haven't watched this one here, the Russian mistake that almost started a war. Maybe I'll watch that on another day. The actual hunt for Red October, which, yes, the story is based on an actual event. However, the actual story is very different. The person wasn't trying to defect, but that's as much as I'm going to say. If you really want to learn about this content, I recommend supporting Paper Skies. If you don't feel like you want to pay to do Nebula, which, I understand. I don't have a ton of disposable income, so I'm kind of poor at the moment, so I can't exactly spend on a lot of stuff. Oh my, a bot! Oh, it had been a while. I was wondering if I wouldn't get one during this video. But yeah, sorry. But if you're able to, if you like this type of content, don't mean me being an idiot and going like, wow, that's impressive. But if you actually have a serious interest in this type of subject, I recommend you listen to Paper Skies for a slightly more in-depth discussion or talk about it. And if you want to have a shorter but more, entertainment focused video, I recommend that you watch, The Fat Electrician. Both of these channels are vastly larger than my own, but, I still believe that I should, say like, oh, these guys do a lot of really good work, and that I should try to say to people who can, because The algorithm may not spread it. Some people have a slight interest in the subject, but just, you know, don't have the full time to fully look into this stuff. And the Fat Electrician tends to cover a lot more weird and interesting things, while a lot of what Paper Skies covers, he doesn't only cover Soviet stuff, but most of the stuff he does cover is Soviet because he grew up in the Soviet Union near the before its collapse, and he was in where modern day Ukraine is, so he is Ukrainian and he identifies as a Ukrainian. And his father was in the Air Force, so he knew a bit more about the Russian or Soviet aircraft than I guess the layman would, because he had a lot of stories from his father and his father's friends. Which, in the West, we don't often get to see an unrestrained, non propagandized version of tales of Russian vehicles and aircraft. Because either we hear it from an American perspective or from the perspective of people who fully believe and drink the USSR Kool-Aid, or propaganda Kool-Aid, which is not great. Or you hear it from the overly zealous anti-Soviet people who are just like everything they built is crap, which being able to find somebody who calls them out when they're not doing well, but is actually able to say when they've done something well is important. I like learning about the Soviet Union, not because I think they're superior or something like that, but because their system is still very, very different, or was very, very different from our own, as somebody who grew up in America. And frankly, I don't just watch these channels, I watch others, but in the event that you don't give a damn about non-military related matters, I'm not going to bore you with the political or the cultural aspects of the USSR, because some people just like talking about airplanes, some people just like talking about military history, and some people only care about a certain niche, and they don't want to listen to me spend an hour talking about a subject unrelated to what they're interested in. I mean, don't have many viewers now, and they're both lurkers, but I'm fine. You can come by and you don't need to subscribe. I would love it if you did, but I don't really care. Most people just stop by and say, "What is this weirdo talking about?" Oh, okay. I guess I'm interested, or I guess I'm not. Just people come and go. That's fine. I appreciate you giving me the time, even though, I'm such a tiny creator. You shouldn't feel I am a lot more interesting when I engage with people, but not everybody either has the confidence to talk online or has the interest in talking online. That's why being a lurker is so popular for a lot of people. And on top of that, my connection. Oh, didn't I get rid of that? I thought I blocked that. All right. But yeah. Sorry about that. I'm also just trying to fill up the time. I have to leave. I have to leave in about 8 minutes for work. I've been streaming a little less due to being tired, but if I don't stream as much, I'm less likely to get people to view. I do need an average of 3 viewers per stream to be able to be monetized. It is the final requirement that I need to fulfill to make affiliate. But what would help is if I stream during hours where people are actually on. But unfortunately for me, I have to wake up for where I live at like 3 a.m. due to the various medications that I take and other stuff like that. So I can't exactly, go to bed at like 11. I have to go to bed pretty early. I actually have to take a number of medications, and then I have to wait for them to take effect, which is why I wake up at 3 a.m. even though I work at 6. And on top of the fact that I'm lucky because my workplace is like 10 minutes away from where I live. So, that I'm able to do a bit of a stream beforehand. But, like, as I said, I'm very surprised that the second person is still here, because I'm basically saying nothing and just being boring. I go like, and this is my life. So, still, I'm appreciative that you're here, but I can understand if you leave. I guess one more recommendation I'll make. Since you listened to me talk about Paper Skies and also The Fat Electrician, if you want to listen to longer form content, which is also done with an entertainment focus and is done by somebody who's rather brash, I would recommend, Laserpig. Although Laserpig, from my experience, has not really uploaded a lot recently. At least not on his main channel. Or at least his main YouTube channel. He does collaborate with other people. But, he does, recently he's basically been doing streams reacting to, the Russian propaganda parades or Russian things like that. Which, I'm not as big a fan of, especially since it's ironic. I don't like watching many streamers because, well, I have ADHD, which makes it so my attention span is rather short, and I don't always like every joke he makes on his streams with his friends. However, for the video where he focuses on a specific battle, a specific part of piece of technology, or a aircraft, or even a person or people of interest, I think his videos are very good for that. Although it depends on if you want a sort of weeb version of it. He's also not afraid to insult vehicles that people are very, very big fans of, to say the least. Like the Horton Ho, the stealth bomber of the Third Reich, which is not a stealth bomber. He also talks about, well, I'm not sure if I should recommend it. It depends. He is very, very openly gay and very, very flamboyant in the way that he tells things. Which, if you like that, then it's excellent. If you do not, then it can be hard to watch. If you're looking for a serious, no nonsense description of the vehicles and their history, then Laserpig is absolutely the wrong person for you to ask or for you to watch. In that event, I would say that Paper Skies is better. Although, as I said, it depends on whether you want this content to be more entertainment focused or just purely historically accurate and, I don't think many people want to listen to somebody drone on endlessly like, In the Battle of 1812, there was something occurring. Then something else happened. And you might be able to do that for hours, but you're not exactly going to keep viewer retention. So as I said, for longer format, I would recommend Paper Skies for the more serious one, and Laser Pig if you're more into the meme side and references like that. And Fat Electrician covers a number of things that are good for the shorter. There are some long videos that he makes, but a lot of his videos are, in my opinion, really interesting, especially even if you don't necessarily like his style or the way he talks. I do recommend that you look into the subjects that he talks about due to how interesting they are and oftentimes how they are not covered in a lot of, traditional coverage of history, such as the time America dropped beavers by parachute into new locations, which is an actual thing that happened. If you want to learn more about it, I recommend you watch his America's Airborne Beavers, Operation Beaver Drop. It actually happened. And then, just like the various other things, like trying to figure out, like, which one to recommend. Learning about America's most iconic delivery system, which is the American mail truck, or the Grumman LLV, which is, yes, the mail truck used around America is in fact designed by a company that designs military aircraft. One of the videos I was going to react to today was the Berlin airlift, and like how communism turned East Germany into a prison state. But I've run out of time. One other thing I would strongly recommend you look into is The Limping Lady, the deadliest spy of World War II, Virginia Hall. She is somebody who is from my home state of Maryland. And she is not really covered, but she had a hard life and is an actual good story. A lot of people talk about strong female role models, but she is a great one. She existed at a time where people were actively like, "You're a woman, you can't do anything at all." But she was qualified, she was talented, and she did not care about spreading the stories of what she did because she was a spy. And all of her talkative friends were targeted. So she did not want to, die like them. And still, people don't cover her much, but it's a fascinating story, and I recommend that if you're willing to, learn about it, it's great. She's a great role model. It's not an insufferable story where like, oh my God, women are amazing and men suck, men need to choke on their dicks. It's a good story that I think, regardless of whether you are, a liberal or a conservative, or whatever the hell your views on feminism are, that it is a fascinating story that I recommend people listen to. Well, I actually have to leave. I actually had to leave a few minutes ago when the last alarm went off, but I thank you for the 2 viewers who stuck around this long. I really have to go. I'll open this up so that I can potentially watch it later. Oh, I mean here. Nope. No.
I don't have a daughter.
Damn it. Okay. Well, yes. Thank you for coming by, even if you actually just went away and you're still a viewer because you were literally just on a bathroom break while your phone was on elsewhere. I appreciate everything that you did, that everyone who came by and gave me a chance. I hope you have a great day, and I'll try to stream later in the afternoon, but it's probably not going to be a military history related subject. It's probably, well, it might be, but it might be a game or something. I need to figure it out. Have a great day, and I hope that you have a good evening, morning, or night, whatever your time zone is. Thank you, and goodbye.